It began with a missing child report. 5-year-old Elijah Lewis hadn't been seen in weeks, but when police knocked on the door of his mother, Danielle Dauphinais, she told them he was staying with a friend in New York. The house was quiet, too quiet. No toys, no laughter, no signs of a little boy at all. That was the first sign that something was very, very wrong. Elijah was a small child with a radiant smile, the kind of boy who left a glow wherever he went. Neighbors remembered his bright eyes. Family members described him as joyful, curious, and full of life. But behind closed doors, Elijah's world was cruel and lonely. His mother, Danielle, often spoke of him as the problem child. Instead of protecting him, she grew bitter, resentful, and violent. The one person he should have trusted most, who became the person he feared. In October 2021, those fears became reality. Relatives started to notice Elijah had vanished. There were no new school records, no birthday celebrations, no fresh pictures of him smiling. Concern turned into alarm, and the police launched a missing child investigation. The search stretched across multiple states. Hope flickered that Elijah might be found safe, until 10 days later, in the woods of Abington, Massachusetts, investigators uncovered a shallow grave. Inside was the small broken body of Elijah Lewis. The autopsy was devastating. Elijah had endured starvation. He had been beaten. He had been forced to stand for hours, deprived of food, made to sleep on the floor. His tiny frame bore the marks of relentless cruelty. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't neglect that went too far. It was systematic abuse. His own mother had let him waste away until his body gave out. Detectives began piecing together the truth. They found Danielle's text messages where she spoke of wanting to get rid of her son. Witnesses testified that Elijah had been treated like a prisoner in his own home. Danielle's boyfriend, Joseph Stapp, was implicated too, helping conceal the abuse and Elijah's death. The puzzle was gruesome, but it was clear Elijah hadn't just slipped through the cracks. He had been pushed into them. When Danielle and Joseph were arrested in New York, Danielle's lies unraveled. She tried to shift blame, to deflect, to claim she was overwhelmed. But the evidence was merciless. By the time her case reached court in 2024, there was no denying the brutality. Prosecutors called her a mother who had chosen cruelty over love. The defense painted her as manipulated by her partner, but the jury and the evidence knew better. In September 2024, Danielle Dauphinais pled guilty to second-degree murder. On October 25, 2024, Judge William Delker sentenced her to 53 years to life in prison. He looked her in the eye and said words that cut through the courtroom. "You were Elijah's mother?" The one person he should have been able to rely on for protection and love. Instead, you inflicted cruelty, starvation, and pain until his small body gave out. Family members wept as the sentence was read. Justice was delivered, but healing remained impossible. Yet Elijah's story didn't end there. In May 2024, his biological father, Timothy Lewis, filed a wrongful death lawsuit. The lawsuit named Danielle and Joseph, but also Joseph's mother, Sharon Stapp, who had allegedly witnessed the abuse and said nothing. And it named the New Hampshire Division for Children, Youth, and Families, DCYF, accusing them of failing Elijah, of ignoring the warning signs that could have saved him. The lawsuit kept Elijah's name in the headlines, and so did the reforms it inspired. His case became a rallying cry for lawmakers who demanded change within the state's child welfare system. Elijah's death forced a reckoning. It wasn't just Danielle who failed him. It was an entire system that turned away until it was too late. Today, Elijah is remembered in vigils, with candles glowing in the night, stuffed animals laid gently in his honor, and tears shed by strangers who never knew him but felt his story deep in their bones. He has become a symbol of reform, a reminder that the smallest voice can reveal the largest failures. And even though his short life ended in tragedy, Elijah's story continues to echo in courtrooms, in legislatures, and in the hearts of those who believe no child should ever suffer as he did. Case 2. Katlyn Marin, the murder of Brielle Gage, Nashua, 2014. It was the morning of November 25th, 2014, just 2 days before Thanksgiving, when a call came into Nashua Emergency Services. A mother was screaming, her voice sharp with panic, claiming her daughter wasn't breathing. Paramedics rushed to a modest home on Oak Street, their sirens slicing through the cold autumn air. Inside, they found 3-year-old Brielle Gage lying lifeless. Her tiny body, so small it barely seemed to weigh anything in the arms of first responders, was covered in bruises, contusions, and internal injuries. Even hardened professionals, men and women who had seen the worst of humanity, froze at the sight. Brielle wasn't just another child. She was described by neighbors as lively and radiant, a little girl with sparkling eyes and a smile that could melt anyone's heart. Family friends said she loved to play with dolls, and like most children her age, her laughter filled rooms. She should have been celebrating the holidays with her siblings, surrounded by warmth and love. Instead, she had become the victim of unimaginable cruelty at the hands of her own mother, Katlyn Marin. Katlyn Marin was no stranger to instability. Her life had been marked by brushes with the law, substance abuse, and struggles with her own emotions. Yet, despite previous involvement with Child Protective Services, she was entrusted with caring for Brielle. For outsiders, Katlyn appeared overwhelmed, but what no one fully grasped was the dark rage that festered inside her, one that would erupt again and again onto her children. Testimony later revealed that Brielle had endured a pattern of abuse. She was punished harshly, often left bruised and battered, her fragile body forced to endure violence that no child should ever face. Brielle's final days were not filled with play or comfort. They were filled with fear. That November morning, Marin snapped. Reports state she brutally beat Brielle, striking her again and again. By the time Katlyn called 911, her daughter's small body had already sustained fatal blunt force trauma. The emergency responders who rushed her to the hospital could do nothing. Brielle was pronounced dead at just 3 years old. The autopsy revealed the horrifying truth. Brielle's body carried signs of repeated blunt force trauma, injuries inflicted over time. Some were fresh, others had begun to heal. Proof that this was not an isolated incident. It was systematic abuse. Medical examiners testified that the internal damage to her organs was consistent with violent, repeated beatings. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a fall or a clumsy mistake. This was deliberate, violent murder. Detectives from Nashua police pieced the puzzle together. Witnesses reported seeing Brielle with unexplained injuries before. Teachers and neighbors had quietly worried. And behind closed doors, Katlyn Marin seemed to seethe with anger at her daughter. Investigators dug into Marin's past and found a chilling picture of neglect, violence, and rage. The evidence was overwhelming. Marin was arrested and charged with second-degree murder, along with assault and child endangerment charges. The trial began in 2016, nearly 2 years after Brielle's death. The courtroom was packed with family, journalists, and members of the public who wanted answers. Prosecutors painted Marin as a violent, unfit mother who took out her frustrations on her defenseless daughter. They presented the medical examiner's grim findings: the bruises, the internal injuries, the sheer brutality of Brielle's final hours. Jurors were shown photographs of Brielle's tiny body, covered in marks, evidence so gut-wrenching that some struggled to look. The defense attempted to argue that Marin was overwhelmed, that her life circumstances had spiraled out of control. They implied that she hadn't intended to kill Brielle, only that she had lost control. But the prosecution countered with expert testimony that Brielle's injuries were the result of prolonged, intentional abuse, not a momentary lapse. At the heart of the trial was one chilling truth: A mother is meant to protect, not destroy. In May 2016, the jury found Katlyn Marin guilty of second-degree murder. The judge, hearing the evidence and the community's cries for justice, sentenced her to 45 years to life in prison. For those who loved Brielle, the sentence was both justice and tragedy. Justice because Marin would never again harm a child. Tragedy because no prison sentence could bring back the little girl with the bright smile who had been taken from them forever. Today, Katlyn Marin remains incarcerated. She will likely never walk free again. But Brielle's death has left a wound that has not healed. In Nashua, community members still gather to remember Brielle. Candlelight vigils have been held in her honor. Child advocates cite her case as proof of the urgent need for stronger protective services in New Hampshire. How, many asked, could a child already on the radar of authorities slip through the cracks so completely? Brielle's death is a sobering reminder. Evil does not always appear in the form of strangers lurking in shadows. Sometimes it comes from those meant to love us most. Brielle should have been safe in her mother's arms. Instead, those arms delivered the blows that ended her life. Even years later, the story of Brielle Gage is told not just as a case file, but as a warning, a tragedy, and a call to action. Her name has become part of New Hampshire's collective memory, a reminder of what happens when warnings are ignored and when children are silenced by those who should be their fiercest protectors. Brielle's story is not just about her death, it is about her life. A little girl who deserved laughter, love, and safety. A little girl who should have grown up, gone to school, made friends, and chased her dreams. Instead, her life was cut short by the person she trusted most. And so we remember her, not just as a victim, but as a child whose brief light still shines, urging us never to turn away from the signs of abuse and never to forget the price of silence. Case 3. Unique Gould, the death of Devon Gould Parr, Nashua, 2013. It was a cold January morning in 2013 when police officers in Nashua, New Hampshire, responded to a call that would haunt them long after. Inside a modest apartment, they found the body of a 2-year-old boy, Devon Gould Parr. His tiny frame lay lifeless, his body bearing injuries no toddler should ever endure. For investigators, the sight was heartbreaking. Devon was just beginning to speak, just beginning to discover the world. Relatives described him as a playful, curious little boy with a mischievous smile and a love of cuddles. At 2 years old, his whole future stretched out before him. But Devon's chance at life ended not because of an accident, not because of illness, but because of the very person who should have loved him most. His mother, Unique Gould. Unique Gould's life was one of instability. By her early 20s, she had already faced difficulties with relationships and with caring for her young son. Friends and neighbors recalled seeing signs of neglect. Devon sometimes appeared underfed or carried unexplained marks. Behind closed doors, Gould's frustrations as a mother too often turned into violence. It wasn't long before those closest to her feared that Devon was in danger, and tragically, they were right. On January 20th, 2013, police were called after Devon was found unresponsive. At first, Gould claimed her son had simply collapsed, as if fate had struck him without warning, but the autopsy revealed a darker truth. Devon had suffered severe blunt force trauma, injuries consistent with repeated strikes or a violent assault. The medical examiner concluded that the blows had caused catastrophic internal damage. This was not an accident, it was a homicide. Detectives from Nashua Police began to dig deeper. They learned that Gould's explanations didn't match the medical evidence. While she tried to insist that Devon's death was the result of a fall or some bizarre accident, experts were clear. The injuries required significant repeated force. Witnesses described Gould as overwhelmed and short-tempered, with a history of lashing out at Devon when she was stressed. Prosecutors argued that her anger had boiled over, and on that day, it killed her son. Unique Gould was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. But as the case proceeded, prosecutors faced a dilemma. Proving intent in a courtroom is never simple, especially with a young child victim. Gould ultimately agreed to plead guilty to manslaughter in exchange for avoiding a full trial on the murder charge. For Devon's family, the plea deal was bittersweet. It guaranteed a prison sentence for Gould, but it also meant she would never face the full weight of a murder conviction. In March 2014, Gould stood before the judge and admitted responsibility for causing her son's death. The courtroom was silent as the judge handed down her punishment, 12 to 30 years in state prison. Family members sobbed as the sentence was read. For them, it was justice, but also a cruel reminder that no number of years could bring back the little boy they had lost. Devon's life had been cut short at just 2 years old, leaving behind only memories of his smile and his laughter. Today, Unique Gould remains behind bars, serving her sentence at a New Hampshire state prison. She will not be eligible for release until at least her mid-30s, and even then, parole is not guaranteed. Devon's death left deep scars on Nashua. His case became part of the city's dark history of child abuse and neglect, a reminder that even toddlers, too small to defend themselves, too innocent to understand, can fall victim to the very people who should keep them safe. Community members who attended his memorial remember Devon as a child who deserved so much more. A childhood full of play, a future full of possibility. Instead, his story became a lesson in what happens when warning signs are ignored and when anger replaces love. Devon's life was short, but it mattered. His story, like that of other children lost too soon, forces us to confront a painful truth. Sometimes the greatest threat to a child is not outside the home, but within it. And sometimes the person they call mom becomes the source of their greatest fear. Case 4. Kayla Montgomery lies in the disappearance of Harmony. Montgomery, New Hampshire, 2019 to 2022. A tiny girl named Harmony Montgomery was born into hardship. From the very beginning, life tested her resilience. She was partially blind in one eye and had special needs. Instead of the stability every child deserves, Harmony was passed from home to home, shuffled through foster care, and let down by systems that promised to protect her. By 2019, the courts made a fateful decision. Harmony was placed in the custody of her father, Adam Montgomery. She was only 5 years old. This should have been the moment when her life steadied, when she found safety, when she was finally allowed to simply be a child. Instead, she was delivered into a house of horror. The home Harmony entered was anything but stable. Adam, his wife, Kayla Montgomery, Harmony, and Kayla's 2 young sons soon spiraled into homelessness. They lived not in a warm house, but in a car, cold and cramped, the children wedged in the back seat. It was there, on December 7th, 2019, that Harmony's life came to an end. Kayla would later testify to what happened. She said Harmony had bathroom accidents in the car, accidents that enraged her father. In a sudden outburst, Adam turned around and punched his daughter, not once, but again and again. Kayla recalled the look on his face, calling it evil. She admitted she wanted to intervene, but fear paralyzed her. Adam had beaten her before, and in that moment she said she felt powerless. Harmony moaned, cried out, and then went silent beneath the blanket Adam threw over her. At just 5 years old, she died in the back seat of a car, her last moments filled with terror and pain, her final breaths stolen by the man who was supposed to protect her. What followed was almost as horrific as the crime itself. Kayla testified that Adam folded Harmony's body in half and stuffed her into a duffel bag. For months, the little girl's remains were hidden inside a cooler, moved from place to place, until they were finally discarded. To this day, Harmony's body has never been recovered, and Kayla, she didn't run to the police. She didn't tell the truth. She helped hide the crime. For nearly 2 years, while Harmony's mother, Crystal Sorey, begged authorities to search for her daughter, Kayla Montgomery lied. She told investigators she last saw Harmony alive on a particular date. She said she was working at her job at the time, trying to build an alibi. She repeated these lies before a grand jury, under oath. Her deception bought Adam time, it bought him silence, and it robbed Crystal Sorey and the world of the chance to know the truth sooner. In the end, Kayla was not charged with murder. Instead, she was convicted of perjury for lying about her job and her knowledge of Harmony's whereabouts. For many, this conviction felt like a hollow form of justice, because while Adam Montgomery would later be convicted of Harmony's murder, Kayla's guilt was written not just in her perjury charges, but in every silent moment when she chose fear and self-preservation over protecting a child. In court, as prosecutors recounted Harmony's final moments, Crystal Sorey wept openly. She listened to the woman who had lived alongside her daughter, described the beatings, the concealment, the lies. Kayla admitted she had been afraid of Adam, afraid for herself, afraid for her other children. But every excuse, every justification collapsed under the weight of what was lost. Because while Kayla feared for herself, Harmony had no choice at all. She was 5 years old. She was partially blind in one eye, vulnerable and defenseless. She was trapped, and Kayla let her down. The tragedy of Harmony Montgomery's death became one of New Hampshire's most haunting cases. It exposed failures at every level, from child protection systems that returned her to Adam, to a stepmother who could have told the truth, but instead chose silence. Kayla's lies prolonged the agony, stretching Crystal Sorey's desperate search across years instead of days. The world would not learn Harmony was gone until long after her tiny body had vanished forever. Even with Kayla's guilty plea, many believe the real crime wasn't just perjury, it was betrayal. Betrayal of a little girl who deserved to be safe, to be loved, to be protected. Kayla Montgomery's role in this tragedy wasn't written in fists or bruises, but in silence and deceit. She failed Harmony in life, and she failed her in death. For a child already born into hardship, already blind in one eye, already vulnerable, the betrayal was total. Harmony's name will forever be remembered in New Hampshire, not just as a victim of her father's violence, but as a child silenced by a stepmother's lies. Case 5, Jazzmyn Rood, The Death of Eve Tarmey, Rochester, 2015. It was the cold morning of October 17, 2015, when police in Rochester, New Hampshire, were called to a local motel. Inside one of the rooms, they found a teenage girl lying unresponsive on the bed. Her name was Eve Tarmey, just 17 years old. A high school student with dreams still ahead of her, her life had been suddenly cut short. As paramedics tried desperately to revive her, the grim reality settled in. Eve had overdosed on a lethal mix of heroin and fentanyl, another young life swallowed by New England's drug crisis. But this case carried a particularly shocking twist. The drugs that killed her hadn't come from a stranger in a dark alley. They had been supplied by the very person who was supposed to protect her, her own mother, Jazzmyn Rood. Eve Tarmey was described by her friends as vibrant, full of potential, and deeply loved. But like many teenagers caught in fragile moments of adolescence, she struggled to find her place in the world. She was impressionable, still searching for guidance. What she needed was a mother to steer her toward safety. Instead, she was handed the very poison that would take her life. For Jazzmyn Rood, drugs were already a part of daily life. Struggling with addiction and poor decisions, she allowed her world, and her daughter's world, to spiral into chaos. Rather than shielding Eve from danger, she exposed her to it. On that October morning, Eve had taken the heroin-laced fentanyl her mother provided. Within hours, her breathing slowed. Her lips turned blue. The hotel room became her final place on earth. When investigators arrived, they quickly realized this wasn't just another tragic overdose. This was a crime born of neglect, of betrayal, and of the darkest form of parental failure. Detectives uncovered that Jazzmyn had been involved in purchasing and providing the drugs that killed Eve. She and her boyfriend were wrapped up in the transaction that ended in tragedy. Witnesses testified that Eve had been caught in the crossfire of her mother's addiction and irresponsibility. The evidence showed that Eve had been robbed of her chance at adulthood by her own mother's choices. Jazzmyn Rood was arrested and charged with federal drug crimes. In court, prosecutors laid out the painful story. A teenager given the very tools of her own destruction by the person she trusted most. The defense attempted to argue that Jazzmyn hadn't intended to kill her daughter, that she was lost in her own addiction, but the court saw clearly, intention or not, her actions had led directly to Eve's death. In December 2016, Rood was convicted on federal charges related to distributing drugs that caused her daughter's death. The judge, emphasizing the severe betrayal of a parent's duty and the lethality of the drugs, handed her a powerful sentence: 20 years in federal prison. For the community, the punishment finally matched the magnitude of the loss. 20 years behind bars for a young life forever extinguished. Family and friends of Eve spoke out, describing their heartbreak. They would never see her graduate, never see her start a career or a family of her own. For them, the sentence provided a measure of justice, a guarantee that Jazzmyn Rood would pay a heavy price for her failure. Today, Jazzmyn Rood is serving her lengthy sentence in federal custody. She will remain behind bars until at least the 2030s. Her conviction highlighted the devastating toll of the opioid epidemic in New Hampshire, but it also revealed how addiction can warp the role of a parent into something unrecognizable. Jazzmyn Rood's betrayal wasn't just supplying drugs. It was failing to protect her child, failing to break free from her own demons before they consumed her daughter. Eve's story, remembered in memorials and vigils, stands as a tragic warning. What makes her case unforgettable is that the hand that offered her those drugs belonged to her own mother. Eve Tarmey should have had decades of life ahead of her. Instead, her life was cut short because the one person who should have protected her instead led her into the shadows. Case 6, Mercedes Tremblay. The death of Mason Tremblay, Manchester, 2020. On the morning of December 14, 2020, in Manchester, New Hampshire, police officers were called to an apartment complex on Bodwell Road. What they discovered inside was not a robbery, not a break-in, but something far more chilling. A scene that revealed the destruction of an entire family. There, inside the apartment, were the bodies of 36-year-old Mercedes Tremblay and her 2-year-old son, Mason. What happened in those final hours turned a quiet home into the site of one of New Hampshire's most haunting tragedies. Mason Tremblay was just beginning life. At 2 years old, he was still learning to put words together, still discovering the simple joys of toys, colors, and laughter. He was a toddler who relied completely on his mother for everything: food, shelter, safety, love. But the very person meant to protect him became the architect of his suffering. When investigators entered the apartment, they found a horrifying scene. Mason's small body had been pinned against a closet door, trapped beneath the weight of furniture that had been deliberately shoved against it. He was left in a position where his tiny lungs could not fill, his breaths slowly crushed out of him. The medical examiner later ruled that Mason had died of compressional asphyxia. In simpler terms, he suffocated because of the pressure on his chest. The autopsy revealed another horrifying truth. Mason was also severely malnourished. Hunger had already weakened him before his life was finally taken. Mercedes Tremblay's body was found nearby. She had turned a gun on herself, ending her own life with a single shot to the head. The conclusion of the New Hampshire Attorney General's office was blunt and final. Mercedes caused the death of her son Mason before committing suicide. It was not an accident. It was not a momentary lapse. It was a mother extinguishing the life of her child. For Mason, those last hours must have been filled with terror and confusion. A toddler who should have been playing, laughing, and falling asleep in safety instead found himself trapped and suffocating, his cries going unheard. The image of a 2-year-old boy pinned and starving in his own home is almost unbearable to imagine. His last moments were not marked by the warmth of a parent's embrace, but by the crushing betrayal of the person he depended on most. The aftermath shook Manchester to its core. Neighbors struggled to comprehend what had happened. Family members in the community mourned a child whose life had barely begun. Candlelight vigils were held, and strangers who had never met Mason left toys, flowers, and prayers for the little boy who would never see his 3rd birthday. Obituaries would later print both names together, Mercedes and Mason, but the story they leave behind is one of devastating imbalance. Because while Mercedes chose to end her own life, Mason never had a choice at all. The case of Mercedes and Mason Tremblay is remembered as one of the darkest examples of intimate betrayal in New Hampshire. It forces us to confront the most uncomfortable question: how can a mother, the one person a child should trust without hesitation, turn into the agent of his death? Mason's story is not just a tragedy. It is a reminder of how fragile life is when those entrusted with love and care instead choose violence and despair. His short existence, his silent suffering, will forever haunt those who hear his name. And in that haunting, Mason lives on, not as a victim forgotten, but as a symbol of why we must never turn away from the warning signs of neglect, despair, and abuse. Case 7. Shauna Coate, the fentanyl death of Adeline Jeremiah, Londonderry, 2020. It was October 3rd, 2020, when the Londonderry Police Department received a call that would uncover yet another heartbreaking story of a child lost too soon. 21-month-old Adeline Carol Rose Jeremiah, a baby barely old enough to speak in full sentences, had died. The details that surfaced stunned investigators and the community alike. Adeline hadn't died of an illness or a tragic accident. Instead, she had been poisoned by fentanyl, one of the deadliest drugs in America. And the person charged in connection with her death was none other than her mother, Shauna Coate. Adeline was known to her extended family as a sweet, beautiful toddler. She was meant to have a life of laughter and milestones yet to come. But instead, her life ended in pain, and her story became yet another symbol of New Hampshire's devastating fentanyl crisis. According to investigators, Adeline ingested fentanyl while under the care of her mother and the child's father, Mark Jeremiah. Toxicology reports confirmed the presence of the lethal drug in her system. At just 21 months old, her tiny body stood no chance against the potency of the poison. Police launched a full investigation examining how Adeline had access to fentanyl and why safety precautions had not been taken. Evidence revealed that Coate's household was far from safe. Drugs were present, and court documents revealed that Coate and Jeremiah allegedly fell asleep at a truck stop, leaving the children unsupervised after using drugs they had just purchased. This reckless conduct, investigators concluded, created the lethal environment that killed Adeline. Detectives built their case, interviewing witnesses and gathering forensic evidence. What emerged was a devastating picture. A child placed in harm's way because of her parents' choices. Coate and Jeremiah were both arrested and charged with manslaughter and negligent homicide. Rather than going to a full trial, Shauna Coate ultimately pleaded guilty to manslaughter and negligent homicide in March 2022. This plea guaranteed a conviction but spared the family the agony of a full murder trial. Her co-defendant, Mark Jeremiah, also pleaded guilty and received a similar sentence. For the community, the sentencing was a difficult moment of closure. The judge handed Shauna Coate a sentence of 5 to 10 years in state prison. Critically, the maximum sentence was largely suspended, meaning she was eligible for parole after serving only a fraction of the time. Adeline's death became a chilling reminder of the fentanyl crisis that continues to grip New Hampshire. Advocates and community leaders have pointed to her story as proof of how the opioid epidemic devastates not only users but also the most vulnerable, the children. Family members created small memorials in Adeline's name, laying flowers and stuffed animals as they grieved. Her name is now invoked in discussions about child protection and the urgent need to address the spread of fentanyl in family homes. Adeline Carol Rose Jeremiah should have grown into childhood. Instead, her life ended at 21 months, silenced by a drug she never should have been near. Her story is one more heartbreaking chapter in a state plagued by addiction, and one more reminder that when parents fail, it is the children who pay the ultimate price. Case 8. Emily Long, the Madberry Family Murder-Suicide, 2025. On the morning of August 1st, 2025, the quiet town of Madberry, New Hampshire, awoke to news that felt like a nightmare. Police had been called to a home on Evans Road for a welfare check. Neighbors said something seemed off. The shades drawn tight, no movement, no laughter from the children who usually played in the yard. When officers forced their way inside, the scene they uncovered was one of horror. In the living room and upstairs bedrooms, they found the bodies of Emily Long, her husband, and their 2 young children, a boy age 6 and a girl just 8 years old. The Attorney General's office would later confirm what investigators already knew. This was a murder-suicide carried out by Emily herself. Friends and relatives described the Long children as bright, joyful, and full of life. They were siblings who adored each other, often seen riding bikes in the neighborhood or chasing each other in the yard. Their father was remembered as a devoted parent, someone who worked hard to provide for his family and who lit up whenever he spoke about his kids. This was a family that should have had years of love, school plays, birthdays, and holidays ahead of them. Instead, their lives ended inside their own home, at the hands of the person they trusted most. On the outside, Emily Long appeared to be a typical suburban mother, but as the investigation unfolded, fragments of her private life painted a different picture. Reports suggested that Emily had been battling severe mental health struggles that seemed to have gone untreated or unnoticed until it was too late. The community was left grappling with an impossible question. What drives a mother to destroy the very family she helped create? Though the exact timeline may never be fully known, investigators pieced together what they could. Sometime between the evening of July 31st and the early morning of August 1st, Emily turned on her family. The children, still in their pajamas, were killed as they slept. Her husband, too, was attacked in the home. Finally, Emily took her own life. By the time neighbors realized something was wrong, it was far too late. The house that once echoed with the sounds of children's laughter had fallen silent. Detectives scoured the home for evidence, notes, signs of planning, anything that could explain why Emily had done this. The Attorney General later confirmed it as a murder-suicide, though no clear motive was ever released publicly. For many, that was the most chilling detail of all. Without answers, the crime became a haunting question mark that still lingers in Madberry. The aftermath of the Madberry tragedy spread far beyond one household. At the children's elementary school, teachers wept as they prepared grief counseling for classmates who couldn't understand why their friends would never return. Neighbors created a memorial on the front lawn, stuffed animals, flowers, candles, and handwritten notes from children who missed their playmates. For the extended family, the grief was indescribable. They weren't just burying 2 children, but also a father, a son, a brother, an entire branch of their family tree gone in one violent night. Emily Long's case reignited conversations in New Hampshire about mental health, family violence, and the warning signs that too often go unnoticed. Advocates pressed for better resources for struggling parents, pointing to the tragedy as proof that untreated despair can turn catastrophic. But beyond policy discussions, the loss was deeply personal. Madbury is a small town where people know each other, where neighbors wave from their driveways. The Longs weren't strangers. They were part of the fabric of the community, and now that fabric was torn apart. What remains is silence. A house that once represented safety and family became a symbol of loss. For those who knew the Long children, the memories are bittersweet. Bike rides, birthday parties, and bedtime stories that ended far too soon. Emily Long's name is now etched into New Hampshire's true crime history as one of the state's darkest figures. But the story is not about her. It is about her children and her husband, victims whose futures were stolen in an act of violence that no one will ever fully understand. Emily Long's case stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest tragedies are not committed by strangers or outsiders, but from within the heart of the family itself. It is a reminder of how fragile life is, how dangerous untreated struggles can become, and how devastating the consequences are when love is replaced with violence. Case 9, Julia Byrne, the Pembroke Murder-Suicide, 2025. It was a quiet morning in Pembroke, New Hampshire, when police received a call that shattered the peace of the small town. Inside a modest home, they discovered a scene that would haunt investigators forever. 26-year-old Julia Byrne had taken the life of her own 3-year-old son before turning on herself. The Attorney General later confirmed it as a murder-suicide. For the neighbors in the community, it was almost impossible to comprehend. How could a young mother, with her whole life ahead of her, commit such an unthinkable act against the child she had brought into the world? Julia's son was only 3 years old, a toddler at the very beginning of life. He should have been learning his ABCs, running around playgrounds and begging for bedtime stories. At that age, the world is full of wonder. Everything is new, every day an adventure. But instead of a childhood filled with love and laughter, his story ended in violence. He never had the chance to grow, to learn, or to dream. For those who knew him, the loss was unbearable. His name, his smile, his small footprints in the home, all gone in an instant. On that morning in 2025, Julia Byrne made a decision that defied all understanding. Investigators believe she killed her son sometime before taking her own life. The details of how remain closely guarded by authorities. But what is clear is that by the time police entered the home, both mother and child were gone. What remains most chilling is that no one saw it coming. To neighbors, Julia seemed quiet, even reserved, but nothing about her life suggested the violence that was about to erupt behind closed doors. The Attorney General's office quickly ruled the case a murder-suicide, closing the door on any lingering hope of explanation. Without trial testimony or surviving witnesses, the community was left only with questions. Why did Julia do this? Was it despair, untreated mental illness, or something darker that no one saw? What police did confirm was that the tragedy left extended family members devastated, forced to bury not one, but 2 loved ones, a young mother and her innocent child. In Pembroke, the crime sent shockwaves through the small, tight-knit community. Friends and neighbors gathered outside the Byrne home, leaving flowers, candles, and stuffed animals in memory of the little boy whose life had been stolen. At local churches, pastors prayed for healing. At playgrounds, parents held their children tighter. In schools, teachers spoke softly about the tragedy, answering questions from confused children who couldn't understand why their playmate wouldn't be coming back. For advocates, Julia Byrne's case was yet another sign of a hidden crisis. the crushing weight of untreated mental health issues, and the failure of systems to intervene before tragedy strikes. Mothers are often viewed as nurturers, protectors. The very heart of a family, when a mother becomes the source of violence, it rattles society to its core. The Pembroke case sparked renewed conversations about prevention, about recognizing warning signs in struggling parents, and about the importance of providing lifelines before despair turns lethal. Still, in the end, what people remember most is not Julia, but her son, the little boy who never got to experience the fullness of life, the toddler who should have been blowing out birthday candles, not remembered in obituaries. His short life became a symbol of innocence lost and of the urgent need to do better for children everywhere. Julia Byrne's story is one of contradictions. A young mother who should have been filled with hope for the future, yet instead chose destruction. A community that believed it was safe, suddenly shaken by the realization that tragedy can unfold silently, even next door. And at the heart of it all, a 3-year-old boy whose name will be remembered by those who loved him, as a reminder of both love's fragility and the devastating cost when protection fails. Case 10, Lisa A. Barone and her exploitation of her daughter, Manchester Federal, 2012 to 2013. In the quiet, respectable neighborhoods of Manchester, New Hampshire, life was supposed to be safe. This story begins with a young child whose identity we protect, and a mother, Lisa A. Barone, who had built a life on trust. Byron wasn't just any parent, she was an attorney, a professional sworn to uphold the law and defend the vulnerable. Her career provided a flawless mask, a veneer of stability that shielded a terrifying secret unfolding behind closed doors. This facade made the truth, the sheer, unadulterated evil, all the more impossible to comprehend. This child, like all children, depended completely on the person who gave her life. Her world was her home, and her security was vested entirely in her mother's care. But for this girl, the home was not a sanctuary, it was a cage. The protection she was owed was not only withdrawn, but weaponized. From 2012 to 2013, the unthinkable began. Lisa Byron, in a chilling act of calculated betrayal, began to systematically abuse and exploit her own daughter. The crimes were not sudden acts of rage, but a deliberate, horrifying enterprise. The sexual exploitation of a child, the filming of child pornography, and the transportation of that vile material. This was not a moment of weakness. It was a prolonged pattern of predatory behavior, orchestrated by a mother who saw her daughter as a product to be sold and distributed. The innocence that should have been cherished was instead recorded for profit. The dark truth finally surfaced, not through a confession, but through the cold efficiency of a federal investigation. When the trail of digital evidence led authorities to the respectable home of Lisa A. Barone, the shock waves reached the highest levels of law enforcement. How could a professional, a member of the bar, be capable of such monstrous acts? Crucially, the discovery meant one thing. The child was finally out. She was removed from the toxic environment and placed under protection, marking the first step in a long, painful journey toward recovery. The federal prosecution was relentless, ensuring the full scope of Byron's depravity was uncovered. Investigators seized digital devices, cameras, and computers, revealing the meticulously documented evidence of her calculated abuse. The material confirmed Byron's dual role as both the primary abuser and the one who produced and trafficked the exploitation. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a cold, transactional betrayal that demanded the most severe form of justice. Lisa A. Barone was prosecuted in federal court, where the evidence against her was overwhelming. The jury's conviction sealed her fate. The sentencing hearing was a moment of profound gravity, not just for the legal system, but for the moral soul of the community. In a sentence that reflected the unprecedented nature of the betrayal, Lisa A. Barone was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. This lengthy sentence was not just punishment. It was a firewall. a legal certainty that Byron would never again be in a position to harm her daughter. Today, Lisa A. Byron is serving her time, her respectable past forever obliterated by the label of convict. But the true focus of this story lies with the survivor. The child, now grown, lives with a unique and brutal trauma, the absolute breakdown of the most fundamental human bond. Her courage in surviving that darkness is the true legacy of this case. The story of Lisa A. Byron is a chilling reminder that evil can wear the face of competence and respectability, and it underscores the desperate need to believe the quietest voice of a child who is often trapped with nowhere left to run. Case 11, Jazzmyn Cedar-Fultz, the death of a 3-month-old baby, Nashua, 2024 to 2025. On August 8, 2025, the city of Nashua, New Hampshire, was shaken by a heartbreaking revelation. Police announced the arrest of 26-year-old Jazzmyn Cedar-Fultz, a young mother accused of one of the most devastating betrayals imaginable. The death of her own 3-month-old baby. The Attorney General's office confirmed that the infant's death was not the result of sudden illness or some unforeseeable tragedy. Instead, investigators said it was preventable, and that Jazzmyn's failure to seek medical care led directly to her child's death. For a community already weary from too many child abuse cases, this one struck at the deepest level of heartbreak. A baby, only 3 months old, barely old enough to lift its head, was gone. At 3 months old, this baby had only just entered the world, a tiny child whose cries should have been answered with warmth, nourishment, and safety. At that age, every coo and every smile feels like a miracle to parents. Every day is a new milestone, the first time rolling over, the first time recognizing a familiar face. But for Jazzmyn's baby, those milestones would never come. The child's brief life was marked not by protection, but by neglect. For family members and investigators, the tragedy was almost too much to bear. To lose a baby so young, not to illness, but to preventable neglect, felt like a wound to the soul of the community. According to investigators, the infant had been showing signs of distress, symptoms that any attentive caregiver would recognize as dangerous. But Jazzmyn did not bring her baby to a doctor, nor did she seek medical attention. Instead, she allowed the suffering to continue until the child's body gave out. By the time first responders were called, it was too late. The infant was pronounced dead. The case immediately raised alarms. Why hadn't this young mother acted? Why had a helpless baby been left to struggle without intervention? Detectives began interviewing family members, neighbors, and medical experts. The evidence pointed to one devastating conclusion. This was not an unavoidable tragedy. It was the result of criminal neglect. The Attorney General's office charged Jazzmyn Cedar-Fultz with felony negligent homicide. Court documents revealed that prosecutors believed Jazzmyn had failed in her most fundamental duty, the duty to protect the life she had brought into the world. On August 8, 2025, Jazzmyn was formally arrested and arraigned. The sight of a young woman handcuffed and led into a courtroom shocked Nashua. To the public, she looked more like a troubled teenager than a mother accused of killing her infant. But the charges were real, and the grief of the community was immeasurable. During the arraignment, prosecutors laid out the case. Jazzmyn's failure to act had cost her baby its life. Defense attorneys suggested she was overwhelmed, that she lacked resources or understanding, and that the tragedy was not intentional. But for many listening, those explanations did little to ease the pain of knowing a 3-month-old had been failed so completely. Family members sat quietly as the charges were read. Some wept openly, mourning both the child and the shattered family. The courtroom, heavy with silence, was a grim reminder that even in 2025, with so much awareness about child safety, tragedies like this still happen, often hidden behind closed doors until it's too late. As of now, Jazzmyn Cedar-Fultz awaits trial. If convicted, she faces the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. Her baby's death will forever mark her name ensuring that even if she is free one day, she will always be remembered as the mother who failed to protect her child. The case sparked outrage in Nashua. Community leaders asked hard questions. How could anyone fail to notice a child in distress? Could something have been done earlier? And what systems should exist to catch warning signs before it leads to tragedy? Advocates for child safety pointed to Jazzmyn's case as another painful reminder that neglect can be just as lethal as violence. A punch or a blow may take a life in a moment, but inattention, indifference, and silence can kill just as surely. Neighbors organized a candlelight vigil to honor the baby. They didn't speak the mother's name that night. They spoke only of the infant, of a life too short, of a child who deserved a chance to grow. Parents clutched their own babies tighter, rocked them a little longer that night, and whispered promises to never take for granted the responsibility of protecting them. Perhaps what haunts the most about this case is the silence. A baby crying, a baby gasping, and then a baby gone. No one to speak for them, no one to act except the very person who chose not to. The death of Jazzmyn Cedar-Fultz's baby will forever be remembered as one of the most devastating cases of neglect in New Hampshire. It is a story of innocence lost, of failure at the most intimate level of motherhood, and of the need for communities to remain vigilant, because sometimes the danger isn't an outside threat. Sometimes it's right in the crib when cries go unanswered. Case 12. Rhea Jazzmyn, the murder of Margaret Jazzmyn, Plaistow, 2025. The early morning quiet of May 18th, 2025, in Plaistow, New Hampshire, was shattered by a desperate 911 call. Inside a home on Old County Road, police uncovered not only a brutal homicide, but the wreckage of an entire family. Lying on the floor was 39-year-old Margaret Jazzmyn, her body bearing the marks of multiple sharp force injuries. She had been violently attacked in her own home, the one place where love and safety should have been guaranteed. Nearby, officers found Margaret's spouse, 36-year-old Rhea N. Jazzmyn. She was only partially responsive, suffering from injuries of her own. At first glance, it might have seemed like she was a second victim, but investigators quickly determined otherwise. Authorities concluded that Rhea was the attacker, and that after killing Margaret, she had attempted to end her own life. Margaret was a wife, a mother, and the heart of her family. Friends and co-workers remembered her as kind, generous, and deeply devoted to her child. She was the steady presence that anchored her home, the person who provided love and security. In one violent moment, that anchor was destroyed. Margaret's death left her family and community reeling, her absence a wound that could never be healed. Perhaps the most haunting detail of this tragedy was hidden in a short clinical line from the Attorney General's office. A child who lived at the home was physically uninjured and is safe at this time. That single sentence carries an ocean of sorrow. It means a child was inside that home when chaos and violence erupted. They awoke to a normal morning, only to find their world shattered, one parent dead, the other accused of murder. Rhea Jazzmyn was not the child's biological mother, but as Margaret's spouse, she served as a parental figure, a maternal presence in the household. To that child, she was part of the daily rhythm of family life. And with her act of violence, she didn't just take away a spouse. She devastated a child's sense of safety and tore apart their entire world. Later that same day, prosecutors announced that Rhea Jazzmyn had been charged with second-degree murder for recklessly causing Margaret's death. Though she remained hospitalized with non-life-threatening injuries, an arrest warrant was issued immediately. Her trial is pending, but the facts as alleged paint a chilling picture. A parental figure turned violent within her own home, destroying the very family she helped build. For Plaistow, a small and close-knit community, the crime was almost impossible to comprehend. Neighbors described the Jazzmyns as a quiet family. No one imagined the violence that would erupt inside their home. Vigils were held in Margaret's honor, candles lit against the darkness, as loved ones shared stories of her kindness, her loyalty, and the love she gave freely. For the child left behind, the tragedy is beyond words. They did not just lose a mother. They lost both maternal figures, one buried in the ground, the other behind prison walls. That loss is a wound no child should ever bear. The case also reignited painful conversations about domestic violence in same-sex relationships. Abuse is not bound by gender or orientation. It can exist in any household, and when it erupts, it devastates families, leaving scars that ripple outwards through entire communities. This case forces us to confront an unsettling truth. Evil does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from within the home, from the very person a child is told to trust as a caregiver. Rhea Jazzmyn's crime will be remembered not only for the killing of Margaret, but for the betrayal of the child who looked to her as a maternal figure. The child must now live with the knowledge that one parental figure took the life of the other, and in doing so, shattered the home they once knew. Margaret deserves to be remembered for her life, not just her death, as a devoted mother, a loving partner, and a woman whose compassion touched those around her. Her story closes this series of New Hampshire's most evil mothers. But her legacy is a reminder that domestic violence, in any form, is one of the most intimate and devastating betrayals of all. These stories are heavy, but they matter, because remembering the victims keeps their lives from fading into silence. Every candlelit vigil, every courtroom tear, every name spoken out loud, it is a reminder that their lives had meaning. If this episode has stirred something deep within you, I ask you to take one small step. Share your thoughts below. What do you believe could prevent tragedies like these from happening again? What warning signs do we as a society need to stop ignoring? And if you want to continue this journey into stories that are difficult but important to tell, subscribe to Unforeseen Fates. Every story we share is not just about crime, it's about people, about voices that were silenced, and about lessons society cannot afford to ignore. Together, by remembering these children and families, we honor them and we make sure their pain is never forgotten.